Then the next item on our agenda is an update on the UDO zoning map amendment and a request for a public hearing.
Okay, so we'll dive into this. I will try to not go into great detail over any of these items, but please feel free to ask questions as we go along. So I did want to come before you today to provide an update on the research and analysis that's been completed to date with regard to the historic character area in the moratorium that went into effect on October 19th, 2022. I wanted to update the board on the planning board's recommended revisions to the UDO and the zoning map, and to request that the public hearing on this item be held at the Board of Commissioners March 1st, 2023 meeting. As you know, the planning board had 3 opportunities to work with staff on this item. And so what I did in your report is just really break down what each of those meetings entailed. Their first meeting was on November 10th, 2022. Their primary focus at that time was centered around the current existing zoning regulations and the C2 zoning district, incompatible land uses, and what would result to any non-conforming situations that occurred because of any possible rezoning in the future. They were also curious about some architectural, regulation of some architectural elements within this area. So we did talk briefly about the law that was enacted back in 2015, which essentially prohibits the regulation of residential building design elements. It covers exterior building color, type, style, cladding material, materials for roofs, porches, non-structural ornamentation, location of architectural styling, windows, doors, etc. So essentially regulating residential structures in that manner is prohibited. So up next was their December 13th meeting. At this meeting, staff discussed with them some conversations that we had had with property owners within Historic Cottage Row as well as Old Nags Head Place. Property owners within Historic Cottage Row conveyed strong support for having their properties rezoned from a commercial designation to a residential designation. And property owners in the Old Nags Head Place subdivision requested that consideration be given to rezoning their properties and the neighboring properties from a commercial designation to a residential designation. And specifically, we talked about R3 based upon those lots. Some of those lots already being R3, some being C2, some being CR. But in all those scenarios, residential development had been developed to the R3 standard. So, also at the December 13th meeting, we presented our first attempt at some mapping changes. We provided them with a map that contained all the existing moratorium area, which I guess I've failed to say thus far in the presentation. It's from Danube Street north to Hollowell Street, in between the highways. So that area, we had proposed potential rezoning of that area to C1, neighborhood commercial. We talked about what the C1, the intent of that district with the planning board. We had really good conversation with that. And then the second option that we had proposed was taking those primarily developed commercial areas, looking at that as a C1 designation, and then taking the areas that had primarily been developed residential and rezoning that to R3, given that they had already been developed to the R3 standard. As we talked further about that, it became obvious that there was going to be a need for quite a few text amendments that was going to be necessary to Section 6.6, Table of Uses and Activities, to ensure that the way the C1 is written now would reflect the historic character area as it's stated within the comprehensive plan. So as we started to think about all those amendments that were going to be necessary, staff introduced the idea that we could entertain considering a completely new zoning designation. The planning board thought that that might be a good idea to explore. So from there, staff went back and has created a new zoning designation, which is the C5, Historic Character Commercial Zoning District. That is primarily what the planning board focused on at their January 17th meeting. The C5, Historic Character Commercial Zoning District, we will go through, there's several attachments which explain the establishment of the district, the intent of the district, but the planning board did vote unanimously to recommend adoption of the proposed text amendments to the UDO that we will go through here shortly. They also recommended unanimously to recommend adoption of a zoning map amendment to rezone that moratorium to the moratorium area to the combination of the R3 and the C5. We have that map, so I'll pull that up on the screen as we go through. So there's more information included in this packet, but it's essentially just little highlights and bullet points of what the actual amendments relate to. So with that being said, I'll try to just go ahead and go through those quickly. So in addition to amendments to the UDO, there were just a handful of areas within the town code where we recognized that we needed to update to the C5, if that's what the board adopted later on. So just a few areas, section 12.143, 16.73, as it relates to noise levels. I just wanted to bring awareness to that. And then the large amount of amendments are to the UDO. And that's going to be in this document. So as we pull it up here, the first proposed amendment would be to section 6.2.2, which is just the establishment of the C5. You can see where that's proposed. The next proposal would be section 6.2.4, which is where we outline all the commercial districts and provide a narrative about their intent. So that's what we've done here. It states the historic character commercial area, the C5, is established to accommodate neighborhood scale commercial and residential development patterns that are compatible with and protect the surrounding residential areas, including historic Cottage Row. Here's the intent statement that was provided as well. I won't read through all of that, but I'm happy to go back if anyone has any questions with that. Bulk of the proposed amendments comes into play with section 6.6, the table of uses and activities. You can see here we've added the C5 district, and then we've outlined the potential uses that would be permitted within that district and how they're permitted, whether by permitted by right, permitted by special use permit, or either way, permitted by right or special use, but with some supplemental regulations. So let me blow this up. It might be a little easier to see. So for this, planning staff had taken an initial attempt to identify some commercial businesses that they felt fit the category of the C5. When we went through this with the planning board, it was a wonderful exercise. We literally went through every single use and took a quick poll by the planning board of which ones to add to the list. So I won't go through each of those, but I'll scan through slowly for people to kind of get an idea. One thing that I would say is up here you can see what's allowed in the CR, which is their commercial residential. You can see what's allowed in the C1, which is the district that we originally considered for this area. And then the C2, which is what this area is zoned entirely at this point. So you can use this to kind of get an idea of what was previously allowed in these districts and considerations to what is proposed to be allowed. All right, so we will finish that up and then move on to the next item that we're proposing to amend, which is going to be section 8.2, development standards for primary zoning districts. This is a chart within our UDO. It's where we spell out lot area, lot width, minimum front yard depth, side yard depth, rear yard, maximum height, and this final column over here being lot coverage. And when you scroll down, you'll see where the C5 has now been added. We've included the same format for the C5 as all of the previous districts. 15,000 square feet for commercial and single family, 22,500 square feet of lot area for two family. This is consistent as we look up with all the other districts. The minimum lot width we set at 50 feet. You'll see that's going to be consistent with the C1, the CR. So we felt like that was the minimum that's allowed. And when you look at the moratorium area, those smaller lots that could be developed residentially, they're all 50 feet in width already. So side yard setbacks, rear yard, all of those are consistent with other districts. Where it is a little different is over here where we discuss lot coverage. So conversation at the planning board level here was the area that we're talking about between the highways from Danube Street to Hollowell Street. That area seems to be somewhat prone to flooding as it is now. And if we have an opportunity to look at existing lot coverage and perhaps provide an avenue for less lot coverage or more opportunities for permeable paving materials, that we should look at that. So what we did here is we said that 40% lot coverage is allowed for commercial development, 30% plus 300 or 33% for residential. That's the same town-wide. You'll note that we do have a little note here to go along with this 40%. So when you scroll down, we have this footnote under number 9, lot coverage within the C3 and C5. We're going to ask you to refer to section 8.6.6.4, where we have some special requirements for the C5 district. So those will be coming up here shortly. This is a text amendment that we are proposing that came as a result of our conversation with the planning board. When we were going through those uses and activities and we got to the use category of pet shop grooming, everyone felt like pet shop may not be ideal in this location, but to have a grooming facility might potentially be okay. So we just added a line here that pet shops, as a supplemental regulation within the C5, that we would only be looking at grooming. Section 8.3, which is our special development standards for primary districts. This section carries a lot of information. So for the C5 district, we're saying that where the requirements below are in conflict with other areas of the UDO, that this section will supersede. The first item that we have here is that commercial structures on lots that are fronting NC12 shall not exceed 3,500 square feet of habitable building area. So this kind of goes back to the thought that commercial structures in the C5 are going to be that small scale appearance, massing, intensity, and to also be compatible with the existing residential. So then we alternatively have that commercial structures fronting on 158 shall not exceed 10,000 square feet of habitable area. And where you have a commercial structure that has frontage on both NC12 and 158, that structure should not exceed 3,500 square feet of habitable building area. However, if the entirety of that structure is 75 feet or greater from the NC12 right-of-way, then that can be increased up to the 10,000 square feet. So when you look in that area, there are some larger structures. They do have frontage on 158 and 12, but they are 75 feet away from NC12. So that takes them out of that 3,500 and bumps them up to the 10,000. We're proposing an amendment here under the addition of section 8.3.2.2 that says, in addition to achieving compliance with the commercial design standards of Article 10 of the UDO, the Board of Commissioners must also make a finding that the proposed building design reflects the heritage of Old Nags Head and does not diminish the unique architectural character of the Nags Head Beach Cottage Row Historic District or the surrounding properties. So with this, essentially there's two mechanisms for architectural approval for commercial uses. One is just a very simple, obtain 150 architectural design points and you're good. The other one is a longer list of having to meet some site design requirements, building design requirements. In either of those cases, there's potential to meet all of the requirements, yet still not necessarily have the architectural appearance of something that would complement the historic character area. So this was added in as an opportunity to allow the Board of Commissioners the ability to ensure that any new commercial in this district would have some architectural elements to make it more consistent with the area. Lastly, all new construction increases in building area, customer service area, lot coverage, the addition of outdoor storage, customer waiting areas, or any change of use to any commercial structure within the C5 must be approved via the special use permit or site plan review process. So when we were looking at that table of uses and activities, aside from your single family and two family and large residential, most everything else in there you noticed was permitted with an S or an SR. And that goes back to this requirement here, which would be essentially any significant change to a commercial structure within the C5, we're going to treat that as a special use permit, which is going to mean that there could potentially be a sketch plan review involved, planning board consideration, technical review committee would look at it, formal recommendation by the planning board, and then eventually coming to the Board of Commissioners for their consideration. I will note that there was some conversation about this by the planning board, whether it was having every single change of use be a special use permit or not, noting that it does change the timeline for a change of use. It could change the timeline for a lot of things, but given the nature of the area, we thought that it was going to be a good idea to allow that extra time and review. So our next proposed amendment goes back to the footnote where we were talking about lot coverage earlier. So it reads that within the C5 Historic Character Commercial Zoning District, lot coverage shall not exceed 40% of the lot area. Lot coverage may be increased to 50% if the 50% of the lot area with the use of permeable paving materials. So essentially, the C2 is going to allow you 55%. Changing the zoning from C2 to C5 is going to result in potentially a 5% lot coverage decrease. But here's where we're going to note that any new commercial development could go up to 50, but to offset some of those ponding concerns and runoff concerns, that we would look to actually requiring some permeable paving there. And section 8.2, commercial design, this was just adding C5 to the list of uses. The same with regards to signage. We just needed to add the C5 so that if we do consider this, any commercial signage within the C5 is held to the same standard. Same for walls and fences. Dimensional requirements for the supplemental standards for religious complexes. We've essentially already discussed this, but we inserted this into the table to make it clear how sexually oriented businesses are regulated and the distances and parameters from schools, residential zoning districts, et cetera. We wanted to make sure the C5 was included there. And then where transitional protective yards, buffering requirements are required, we wanted to make sure there was consistency there as well. That wraps up the majority, well, all of our text amendments. The next two items that you have in here packet. This is interesting. Staff did this just as for the ability to have some idea of what nonconformities may be created with the proposed C5. So we tried to list all the commercial uses and whether they were permitted uses, not permitted uses, permitted by special use, and then go a step further and to say, would they meet that 3,500 square feet or 10,000 square foot rule? So we won't go through all of that unless you're interested in doing so. And then the map that I think everyone is probably most interested in. I apologize, it's a lot of information, so it's going to take a little bit to download. But essentially, as you heard Basil mention, the planning board did recommend option 2, which is going to be this this third drawing down here, which is a combination of the R3 high-density residential and the proposed C5 historic character commercial area. If anyone's interested, we can print out these maps. Anyone in the public or listening online, happy to print this map out and provide it to you. But here's where we designate the proposed C3 areas and the proposed C5 areas. There's one portion in this inset map that goes beyond the parameters of Hollowell Street North. This was just to go ahead and capture Old Nags Head Place, since it was kind of split by that by Hollowell. So this is the map that has been recommended for approval. So that was a lot of information. I went through it relatively quickly. We wanted to make sure that the board had an awareness of where we were at this time, what the planning board had recommended, and to move forward with advertising for the public hearing, which would involve posting of signs, letters to all affected property owners and everyone adjacent, and the proper advertisements. Okay. That's all I have, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Before we move on to a motion and a vote on setting the public hearing, I ask if there are any questions for Kelly. Commissioner Sears?
I guess one statement, not really question. First, thank you and the planning board for all their hard work in a short time, because it's a lot of work. But can we make sure that the definition for habitable is very clear and stated, so that there's no confusion with
Yes,
that definition moving forward? Other than that, thank you very much for everything.
We'll take
Commissioner
care of
Brinkle?
I think it was good to have this presentation while we make the motion to proceed with the public hearing for our next meeting. It is a lot, but it gave everybody a chance to, not only us, but the public, to hear it and digest it. And thank you for your work and also that of the planning board.
Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Sanders?
I don't have any questions. Just thank you. Yeah, I think it's good. Great presentation.
All right, thank you. Then a motion would be in order to set a public hearing on this topic for our March meeting.
So moved.
Second.
Have a motion and a second. Any discussion? Hearing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Thank you.